Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for joining us for today's Lunchtime Art Talk, which, as many of you already know, is a weekly series led by Hammer curators, where we focus on one work usually, or in this case, one artist. This season, the talks are going to center on Made in LA 2020, which is currently up at the Hammer Museum and at the Huntington Library Art Museum and Botanical Gardens, albeit behind closed doors due to COVID. I will note that there are a few sites that are in the physical and conceptual spacing between the two institutions, and that those are open and safe, and I encourage you to visit them when the stay-at-home order is lifted. So my name is Lauren Mackler. I'm a guest curator at the Hammer Museum, and one of the co-curators of the Made in LA 2020 version. I'll be facilitating this afternoon's talk on Diane Severin Nguyen. Joining me today is my colleague, curatorial assistant, Nick Barlow, who will be helping me answer all your questions later in the program. A little Zoom housekeeping before we begin. If you haven't already done so, please select speaker view on the top right corner of your screen. And in the top middle of your screen, please click on view options and ensure that side by side and fit to window are checked. And that will give you the best view of the program. Also, today's program is being recorded. If you do not want to be recorded, you have the option to toggle your camera on and off using the camera icon at the bottom left of the screen. You will remain on mute until the end of the presentation, at which point Nick will help me and unmute those who have questions and moderate the Q&A. During the presentation, if you have any questions for me or Nick or any technical questions, you can ask those using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so first slide, please. Thank you. Do you need my notes? Thank you. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be here today to talk to you about Diane's work. This is a little bit of a strange format for me as a contemporary art curator. Ideally and usually I would be in conversation with the artist rather than talking about them on my own. So I imagined this talk as kind of as told to format in which I'm going to translate many of the conversations that I, as well as the other Made in LA curators, have had with Diane, who is incredibly brilliant and has been shaping a really unique vocabulary around her work. A vocabulary that she might even sometimes call an ideology, or at least like translating an ideology. So keep your eyes out for an opportunity to hear Diane speak whenever that may present itself. I was introduced to Diane's work first through Lucas Blaylock and Torbjorn Rodeland, who are also two great photographers. They highly recommended her to us during the Made in LA studio visit process. And then there was a follow-up email by Kenneth Tam, and then another by Jennifer Moon, the latter two who are Made in LA alums, 2014, 2016. So the short of it is that Diane commands the attention of her peers, but also her teachers, as some of these people were, not just because of her work, but also because of the language that she articulates around her practice, I believe. Little bio. Diane is from Carson, California. She did her undergraduate studies at Virginia Commonwealth University and then did an MFA at Bard. She comes from an activist background as a young adult and even worked in Washington, DC for a little bit. She was originally focused on political theory, but then became more interested in critical theory and moved from Washington, DC and politics into art. You know, she described it to me as being really interested in where radical power actually lies and described seeing the power in Washington as something quite scripted. Later on in this talk, we'll talk about the soft power of images. So Diane makes photographs. She's also made one excellent video so far, but is likely going to make more. To produce her photo and film work, Diane makes these ephemeral sculptures, these sort of amateur science experiments or setups from found materials, both natural and synthetic. She often describes her choice of material as a mix of ready-made and substance, like the image you're looking at right now, which is obviously water and hair, or maybe not so obviously. Next slide, please. So she captures these very temporary and fleeting sort of constructions at a very close range and shifts their scale, enlarging the details and the kind of relationships that are happening within the image. Writer Franklin Melendez wrote about them that there are these kind of microdramas, and I love that, the idea that it's a microdrama inside the frame. The result sort of pinpoints a moment in time, a moment that's in a state of transforming, something that's a moment where the subject matter lingers between two states. So she's described to me as being particularly interested in the transfiguration of something in front of the lens, the kind of fugitive subject, which is also language she and others have used. Additionally, Diane uses more transient and kind of prosthetic light sources, so something equally temporary in the lighting that illuminates these setups. For example, in the past, the glow of a sunset, an iPhone flash, a battery-powered LED light like some of those small disco lights, or a flame that's flickering. So the camera really intervenes at moments right before these temporary arrangements, as well as their lighting change. So the presentation or the image that you see is something, truly provisional and unstable. And the notion of the unstable is interesting to her both formally and conceptually. So overall, what you're seeing here is, or actually what you're not seeing is an act, kind of something that's somewhat performative. And you're looking at the consequence, which was once in motion and is now fixed. This act, the original kind of setup, is a little bit like alchemy with a cause and an effect. And the result is an image that feels traumatic or as the result of trauma, but more on that later. She describes this work also as not quite abstract because she doesn't think a photograph can ever really be abstract. Next slide, please. This is an installation shot of the first exhibition I saw of Diane's. I actually met her here in February 2019 during Freeze for our first studio visit. It's in a small gallery space near MacArthur Park called Bad Reputation. The gallery actually has extremely large windows onto the city, but she drywalled the windows and cut a smaller, more human scale portal to go alongside her photographs. When I talked to her about this, I described it, and there are more coming later, as an installation component. She talks about it as a simple gesture, a kind of discrete but pervasive act. But when I talked about it as an installation, she described it a little bit more as an alteration of the space because she's working with something that already exists. There are more installations in the Made in LA show that I'll tell you a bit more about later. You'll notice in the caption that this exhibition is titled Flesh Before Body. And that is sort of a quote, a kind of paraphrase from Hortense Spiller's words, which are, before body, there is flesh. So before there's something recognizable and categorizable, there's a substance that composes it. And that substance is really the subject. Theory plays a really big part in Diane's process. She reads an enormous amount. And it filters in these other ways. She's described to me as being more inspired by theory rather than the visual culture that surrounds her. But that said, it's not intended to be didactic. Our friend in common, Lucas Blaylock, once described to me his process with theory as, doing the homework, like sitting there reading a ton of different writers, assimilating a ton of different ideas. And then when exhausted with that research and that thought, going into the studio and producing images, imagining that kind of by osmosis, they would filter into the image. As a process, Diane talks more about trying to make demonstrations or proofs, to use a scientific language, of certain theoretical concepts that she reads. So trying to make them literal and often failing quite humorously to do so. And she stresses the dichotomy between the two forms, the theory and form, and how those two things have to run these kind of parallel tracks next to each other. So that's sort of how she processes theory and thought into her work. Next slide, please. So the way these fugitive subjects are captured at a really decisive moment relates to the violent history of photography. This is a quote by Diane. I think that these images come out of a documentary lineage, which is very violent. I'm working with a provisional moment, the waiting for something to happen, And I compose my images with these strategies, but to totally defunct ends. So when I first met Diane, she talked about the Vietnam War as an example. She described it as an era during which 35mm film cameras and toxic chemicals were being used at the same time and often up against each other. So again, quoting Diane, on one hand, we have this Western liberal pro-peace photojournalism, and on the other, we have something like napalm, which is incredibly photographable. And I chose this image to illustrate that because fire in Diane's images is actually sometimes napalm that she creates using a recipe she found online. She describes it as sticky and that it can spread in shapes. So it's a slower fire that she can work with, which is incredibly dark, of course. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm transitioning into the Made in LA exhibition and what Diane is presenting as part of Made in LA. Made in LA is an exhibition that's happening in the two institutions I mentioned earlier, across town, far west, far east. And as a way of dealing with the two venues and their very distinct qualities, my co-curators and I decided to do a mirror exhibition across town where all the artists are presented at the Hammer and all the artists are presented at the Huntington. So I'll show you Diane's body of work that's at the Hammer and then the one that's at the Huntington. In Diane's case in particular, the two bodies of work really respond to the space in which they're being displayed. And they're really in dialogue with each other. I would say the conceptual underpinnings of them are connected. So this is the Hammer. And at the Hammer presentation comprises 7 photographs that you can see here, and a large scale curtain set up to cast a red glow on the images. And then that glow is compensated, if you look into the image, by blue lights that she had us swap out onto the ceiling. So it creates this eerie halo that kind of corrects the original cast glow. It's a little bit like using photographic strategies in the space. So again, she would talk about this more as an alteration rather than an installation, a way of creating an atmosphere. I would say a way of extending the world she builds within the images into the space of viewing them. A little bit more about this show and these particular works. She made them entirely in her apartment, not even in her studio, because it was right at the beginning of quarantine. So she sort of took everything in there. And scale has always been really important to her. The images are relatively small. And obviously the setups are even smaller. And it's even about sort of these minute sort of shifts in scale. But being in her domestic space, when they are already sort of domestic in scale, really shifted her relationship to the process. Anecdotally, I hope if she's here, she doesn't mind, I'm going to share this, but anecdotally, the experiments she staged were the result of what she describes as a really disgusting living situation because, a bathtub filled with ash or mold growing in different places because of a series of failed experiments that she was trying to photograph and had to wait for and restage. She describes 90% of the experiments she makes as failures and letting things pile up and sort of re-looking at them under different light. Next slide, please. These images very obviously have a relationship to still lives, but as Diane describes it, what she's trying to do is present the minimum requirement of life that's still necessary to be evocative. That is because she's giving animacy to something that cannot come alive, and is also very self-aware within the image of being inanimate. The relationship between photography and death is one that she's very interested in. It's one that Roland Barthes also mentions or talks about in his various writing about photography, the idea that photography can only be the living image of a dead thing for many reasons, but also because a moment like this one is stilled while being fleeting. Diane talks about this as well, the photograph's inherent failure to represent life, but in making failure self-conscious is part of the project that she's doing. Next slide, please. So again, these were made at the very early months, weeks of COVID, and the visualization in her process of the invisible is very productive for her. Diane made these images, in a moment where she, much like everyone else, were really concerned about this new disease. But she found herself also curious and frustrated even by the fear of the invisible that was so pervasive around her. And she describes it a little bit as the morality of germophobia and the policing of the invisible and what that means conceptually. Gloves, as you see here, are particularly interesting to her because they represent the mediation of touch and perhaps even the mediation of empathy. They represent regimes of care, but also fear of contact, the other, wetness, and the thin layer of skin that separates vulnerable interiors from the world. It's a material that she was using pre-pandemic, but that appears extensively in this body of work. She's also described to me how touch is very cultural, and this is kind of a longer conversation, but she's really interested in tracking the cultural differences between the East and the West, and that recurs in the work in various ways. Next slide, please. Diane's images have been described as, both seductive and repulsive. Earlier, I talked about trauma, and here I can talk a little bit about the forensic. She often makes fake wounds, and I think she's interested in wounds for various reasons. One is that they're an illustration of pain, and two, for their liquidity in both senses of the word. Pain because in her activism and her interest in politics, originally, she describes as being aware of how, it's about externalized pain, the pain of others, in a way that Susan Sontag talks in her essay regarding the pain of others about documentary and journalistic photography of war. These images, these fake wounds that she actually creates now allow for a more internalized and subjective representation of pain. It allows her to think about her own pain, a more micro experience in a more micro sort of setting. And through them, she often asks, this is also a quote, can pain be conveyed through an image? Can you be affected without having to experience the thing itself? Which at its core is empathy, but it's also capitalism. And she's thinking about how the work can point towards methods of constructing pain for consumption, and how images influence us viscerally, which is what you could describe as the soft power of images. Next slide, please. I picked this slide. I mean, I'm showing you all the works of Vainelle, but this one's title is particularly interesting also. If a Revolution is a Sickness is the title of this work. And it's one that I can interpret in many ways relating to the pandemic. But this work is also a great example of using titling and language and theory to complicate the read of her image as a kind of partner. Next slide, please. Another image of a wound, or can be read as a wound. Next slide, please. Diane also often talks about the emotional architecture of an image. For example, how a meme can be arranged to draw a narrative via the various sections of the images. So there's really an invisible architecture that manipulates us when we look at photographs. Her images in particular are always floating in air, sort of decontextualized and unmoored, but yet they're staged. So they're very self-aware of being seen or of being created. She's really interested in that aware look that things can have when they're being captured, and sees a kind of authenticity in the self-manipulation of her particular images as an analogy for the desire to be seen in a certain way, which is a very contemporary phenomenon. Next slide, please. Okay, so in short, photography is a medium that claims accuracy, and these works aim to upend that. These photographs are almost impossible to describe in words because they intend to convey a feeling or a sensation like a substance more than a thing. And in that sense, she's working with a really non-verbal space, one that she calls nameless, that's amorphous and that's more tactile than sensorial. Next slide, please. And then this is a presentation at the Huntington, as opposed to the latex curtain that's hanging at the Hammer. This is a series of latex strips, cuts, would be the word maybe, that filter light. Next slide, please. Here's another quote from Diane. Also, at the core of my work is a deep desire to de-essentialize everything, to not let anything be trapped by someone else's knowledge of it. Next slide, please. And I think this idea returns to the violent history of photography through this idea of the violent history of indexicality, or trying to capture something, trying to name it, and then trying to use it for political purposes or illustration. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'm going to finish here. These are pages from the Made in LA catalog. We conceived of the catalog as another space for the exhibition. So we invited all of the artists to make something directly for the page. And given that opportunity, Diane used the space to articulate and reframe her language, but also language that you find around photography. It's probably a little bit hard for you all to read it right now, but it says, you know, capture, captive, captivated, still life, and so on. Photography as an analogy, a tool, but also a subject is interesting to Diane because it is undivorceable from our experience of society right now, and it doubles for the experience of the everyday. You know, she's described to me how historically photography's terms were developed alongside psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic concepts, advertising, military technologies, like words that you would realize from the everyday life, like trigger, capture, shoot, overexpose. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's also an imagistic quality to the words and how she's presenting them here on the page. I guess you could go to the final slide. She's interested in words also for their shape, the way that they land on a page or the way in which they create a negative space. There's more to say about that, but I think I'm far out of time. So I will invite Nick into the screen to moderate any questions that you all may have for me. And we'll sort of take it from there.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren. If you have any questions, you can either submit them in the chat box, which there's an option below to enter into the chat box, or you could raise your hand either physically, or if you go to the participants module at the bottom of the screen, there's an option to digitally raise your hand, and that'll alert us if you have a question. But to kind of start things off, as we wait for some more questions, Lauren, I was wondering if you could actually talk a little bit more about the scale of the works, in the sense that it's quite interesting that they are obviously blown up on the images, kind of bringing it to a larger scale, but she keeps them still pretty tight and compact. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about perhaps what that impulse was, or what that does, or what you kind of, how you read that decision.
Yeah, I think that will end up being more of my own read. I feel like she's talked to me a lot about scale, but the thing that comes to mind right now is the way in which it relates to the body. The images are, yes, scaled up versions of these kind of microdramas, as I like Franklin saying. But then they end up not being sort of at the scale of advertising or a scale that's more monumental or architectural. They remain in the realm of the body, actually, or relationship to the body. And so in that sense, they're unrecognizable as a thing, but they're relatable as a thing. And, you know, your question actually brings up for me, I forgot to mention that in terms of the detail with which she presents the work, the frames themselves, these metal frames, are often, or in the case of the Made in LA show, they're burned on the edges so that they have this kind of coloring from the burning of the metal, which is part of sort of encompassing the process into the objectiveness of the image, I think, in the photograph.
Is she an artist who works does she think of her work as working in kind of series, or is each work a kind of individual kind of entity in amongst itself, or in it of itself?
You know, it seems from my experience that there's a long thought in her work, right? That there's these sort of concepts that she's constantly unpacking or trying to investigate: photography and our relationship, the history of photography, the process of photography, and our relationship to images being a kind of overlapping subject that keeps recurring. But at the same time, each body of work seems to be informed by some theory or something she's reading that she's digesting, as well as an environment in which she finds herself in. There's something, you know, in the way I talked about them as alchemical, there's something about how the environment is such a big part of how the images turn out. And that environment's probably physical, but it's also emotional and interior.
Excellent. Are there any questions? Does anyone want to ask a question? I'm seeing no hands just yet.
I see a question, actually. I was intrigued. In the
really?
chat, maybe? Do you want me to read it?
Oh yeah, I do not see it, so.
Oh, sorry, it's privately to me.
Oh,
should I read it?
I have a question here that it just came in, which is, does she compose the lighting, or is it mostly post-processing?
So the lighting is really temporary. So the lighting is fleeting, just like the setups, which is, you know, since it's lighting in motion, or imagine like one of those like LED disco balls that's flickering, or a flame that's lighting something unevenly. So it is, let's say, composed in the moment because she's consciously using, say, a flame to light the situation. But it's hard to describe it really as composed because the lighting itself is a substance she can't control or can't hold. And the most she does to try to hold it is really by using a kind of flame that is slower, like I was telling you earlier about napalm. But you know, I have never asked her about the post-production process, as in like photoshopping or adding anything. But from the way she talks about photography, I would assume that there isn't that much of that because it's so much about the moment that she's capturing.
Lauren, if the question for you is
Yeah.
that came private is a question you want to read, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was directed privately to me, but it was probably for everyone. The question is, I was intrigued by the comments about politics and her experience in Washington, D.C. as sterile. Is there more to say, particularly regarding any element or image? I think, what was the word she used? She used the word scripted in Washington, D.C. And, you know, I just found this out. So I would be very curious to hear her talk a little bit more about it. But I think what was interesting to me about hearing this background is that this relationship between the pain of others, looking outwardly in a kind of journalistic and documentary way towards what's happening in the world and what kind of horrors are happening in the world, versus looking kind of more privately and internally and inside the kind of cave that is the artist's studio, to look at collective sort of social experiences at a more intimate, minute level. Her experience in DC, I think, you know, she sort of started from activism because she is really ideological and she has a lot of thoughts and beliefs, and certainly had, you know, even more so as a young adult, I'm sure. And then found that that illusion of power, I think, at that scale was less interesting than the kind of power that culture has, which is something I think is a really profound realization. Really interesting.
Great.
I think that was the last question, huh? I think that that's all the time that we have actually for today, which doesn't feel like enough to talk about all this work. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I asked Flor to add in the chat a series of additional readings for those of you who are interested in knowing more and dig deeper into Diane's work, a lot of conversations she's had with other people. And then you can support the Hammer and all of its great programs by donating on the Hammer website. I hope that you will all come next week for the Lunchtime Art Talk led by curatorial assistant Vanessa Arzamendi on Mario Ayala, another great artist of Made in LA. And that's it. Thank you all. Goodbye. Have a good day.